All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the sixth and final webinar in our CVI Action Plan series. Over the past several months, we talked about standards, wellness, research, training, and narrative change. Today, we close with a topic that sits at the center of whether any of this work can grow, be protected, or be sustained, and that's policy and advocacy. For decades, community violence intervention has been carried by frontline workers, credible messengers, and community organizations long before the field had a name. But as many of us know, practice alone is not enough. If we want CVI to be recognized as a core part of public safety and public health, not a side project, not a pilot, not a temporary initiative, then policy and advocacy are the levers that make this possible. Policy is how we take what works on the ground and makes it durable. Advocacy is how we ensure that people closest to the pain are also closest to the power. And together, they are how we protect this work from political wins, funding cycles, and the tendency of institutions or overlooked or undervalued community rooted solutions. Everyone on this call plays a role in that. Whether you're a practitioner or a researcher, a funder or a policymaker, or a partner, you are a bridge between communities that have lived this work for generations and the systems that are only now beginning to understand its impact. You are the bridge between what CVI has already proven and the people who have not been introduced to this work. And you are the bridge between the urgency of today and the long-term change for our communities they deserve. Our goal today is simple: to deepen our understanding of how policy and advocacy can strengthen CVI ecosystems, to expand resources and ensure that the progress we've made is not temporary, but transformational. Thank you for being here, for staying with us through this entire series, and for continuing to push the movement forward. Let's get started. With that note, I want to also highlight that throughout the conversation today, there's a Q&A chat that we encourage you to ask questions, which we'll get to in a second. And I also want to introduce a really good colleague, friend of mine that I've known for some years, uh, and more to say at some point. But I want to really bring up to the stage Amber Goodwin, who's been a pioneer in our work, in our advocacy and policy. Amber.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Eddie. Can you guys hear and see me okay? Okay, great. Thank you guys so much for being on here. And I apologize, I'm going to have to hop off in about 20 minutes. Many of you may know, while I was an organizer and an advocate, I also became an attorney. And so I have an emergency hearing I've got to go to. And so I'll be on listening. And so just really excited. Thank you to Eddie. Thank you to everyone who planned this together, the whole team that I know it takes a village to put together even conference calls. And I just see so many amazing advocates, frontline practitioners, incredible people who are on the call. So thank you, thank you, thank you for all the work that you do. I always say that we could not do any of this work. There would be no CVI action plan. There would be nothing if it wasn't for the frontline practitioners that are the pioneers to this work. No offense to members of Congress or to mayors or anyone like that, but they didn't dream this stuff up. You guys did. And so just thank you for everything that you've been able to do. So when the CVI action plan, you guys have been through the last couple of modules of this, when the CVI action plan many years ago now, almost 3 or 4 years ago, was just a dream. A lot of the conversation at the very beginning was how do we make sure that not only institutional funders through traditional philanthropy, but also institutions like government, how do we get sustained funding in this work? And how do we do it in a way that actually utilizes tried and true tools like policy and advocacy? And so a lot of this work, many of you have been doing policy and advocacy on the ground for such a long time, for decades, and it maybe just wasn't called policy and advocacy. As you guys have talked about, and we've all talked about, CVI wasn't called CVI until someone named it. And so I think the naming of it, it was just a very big distinction. And I'll talk a little bit about the timeline. The pillar was created very specifically because, as Eddie said, we knew that we needed to have a through line of how we were actually going to advocate about the work that needs to happen and how we were going to think about what does organizing look like? How are we, or utilizing our flexing our organizing muscle? So how are we building community power, building collective power on the ground? And so that was one big pillar that, to be honest, at the very beginning of the CVI action plan wasn't a part of the plan. And then we heard from so many of you, people from like the Free and other community-based organizations that said, hey, we need to have a part here that's just talking about how year-round we build collective power. And then secondly, there were so many people who were like, I actually write legislation. I do things like that. I want to learn. I want to make sure that there's a pillar that talks about not just things on the federal level, like the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act and what's happening at the federal level, like Pam will talk about, but like, how do we make sure that there's actually, we are writing policy, we are at the decision-making tables to talk and write about policy and not just having somebody else do that. And then lastly, we needed to make sure that there was an advocacy component to this. So really truly understanding that we didn't want somebody else to be telling our stories. We are the arbiters of the best way to tell our own stories, and especially the people who do this work full time. And so we wanted to make sure that that was a full pillar. So the first version of the CVI action plan actually didn't have organizing, but it's really organizing, advocacy, and policy all together. And we kind of put the organizing and advocacy together because it was important for us to do that. And so this pillar was extremely important. It is something that I think gets a lot of attention because for I think both philanthropy, but then also government institutions, they fundamentally understand what these words mean. But when we're connecting it to the work that's happening on all levels of government, this is a new thing for many people in our field. Eddie and I and Reggie Moore were the first people, actually. Eddie, I think it's been, I don't know how many years, I guess it's 2019. We testified in front of Congress in the first congressional hearing on gun violence prevention in communities of color. And one of the first things I wanted to say is shame on you guys. It's 2019. I know how many times you guys have had people testify about things like background checks and things that are really important, but you haven't had people that look like us and do the type of work like Eddie was doing and it continues to do. And so it was really important for this advocacy pillar to not just talk about Congress, not just talk about what's happening at the state level, but also so much work. All politics is local. We wanted to make sure that people truly understand the impact that could happen at the local level as well. And so that's why this was created, and it was designed really to achieve an all of government approach on every single level of government, because we know we can't let a county, if we've got a dog catcher, that dog catcher needs to know what CVI is, and they also need to know why it needs to be funded, and also needs to be able to educate their peers on it. So I'll go to the next slide. So 3 priorities, I kind of talked about this a little bit, but year-round advocacy, we don't want to just be talking about what new policies we need, but also we want to be talking about how we are doing that all year round. If you look back at history at successful organizing, advocacy, and policy, they're not just doing it whenever there's budget cycles in August and September, we're doing it all year. And so really thinking about how we are doing this on all levels of government and doing the really, just to be quite frank, unsexy work of going and talking to that random city council person, or going and talking to a governor who may not be the same political party as you, but they really support CVI, and really thinking about how we're doing that on all levels of government and not just putting all of our eggs in one basket. One big piece that we've really talked about a lot is engaging like attorneys generals and other people like that. And so that's been a really positive way. And Pam can talk a little bit more about how we've done that on the state level. And then expanding and protecting the work we do. We saw what happened last year when $810 million was cut. We're building it out, different legal arms to this work as well. And so how do we make sure that we're holding people accountable and also protecting the work we're doing, and then coordinating these efforts across the country? And so we'll talk a little bit more about it. I know Pam will talk about the federal policy and some of the state work that we're doing, and Jose will talk about some of the local, but I will jump back on. But I wanted to give you guys a little bit of an overview of how this all started and how it needs and must continue. This is one of the most important years of our entire lives. This is not a political statement, it just is. And so we need to make sure that we're engaging our peoples on all levels of government to make sure that we can sustain and fund this work. So I'll turn it over to, I think, Eddie or Pam.
Awesome. Thanks, Amber. Everyone can hear me, right? All good? Perfect. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Pamela Mejia. For those that don't know me, I'm a longtime consultant for community justice. I've had the privilege of supporting their federal advocacy goals and priorities. So I specifically play a role in really making sure that CVI programming is funded through the annual appropriations process, and also that members of Congress across the aisle, both Democrats and Republicans, are educated about this work and support CVI programming and the larger field through getting dollars approved and out to communities. So today I'll be briefly going over the progress we've made federally, where we are today, and what's at stake, and really talk about those solutions that Amber briefly mentioned. So First, just a quick look back to our advocacy efforts. As you all know, in 2021, when Biden entered office, Democrats were also in control of the House and Senate. So there was a lot of opportunity to make an impact. And thanks to all of the hard work from everyone on this call in the greater field, especially those folks that work on the ground serving people, we had the opportunity to influence policy and get real dollars out the door and into communities. So just to look back in total, hundreds of millions of dollars were invested in CVI through the American Rescue Plan Act. In 2022, the following year, we saw the inception of DOJ's Community-Based Violence Intervention and Prevention Initiative, which is known as the main federal funding source for the CVI field. And President Biden at the time also issued an executive order that allowed CVI organizations to be eligible to apply for funding opportunities throughout different agencies. And as you all know, we saw the first gun violence prevention package in 30 years be signed into law, and that included $250 million for CVI over 5 years. So all of this is due to the field's hard work and Democrats' support of this, especially as well. And most advocacy groups, or some, they don't always see this much progress at that speed. So that's something, that was really a blessing, but well deserved and overdue, of course. As Ember mentioned, you all have been doing this work for a very long time, beyond way before when Congress actually started acknowledging it and funding it. But now, not just for our movement, but many others, the second Trump administration has caused a major ideological shift and made the political environment even more partisan and unfortunately harmful to our community. So I'm just going to start with the structural funding shifts. First, with the DOJ grant cancellations. April of last year, as you all know, DOJ terminated over 360 grants totaling over $800 million in funding. Included was DOJ's CVIPI program. They cut over $150 million in funding, and many of those dollars were taken from CVI organizations. So as a result, many of those organizations had to force staff to move from full-time to part-time, and then as a result, a lot of services were reduced and services that were reduced that were really intended to be expanded. And DOJ's justification for that was that the CBO grant awards no longer aligned with OJP's mission and priorities, and this was essentially part of a broader effort to cut federal spending. Their justification was really criticized and as vague and insufficient, which is accurate. And they didn't really go into detail. It was clear to the public that many of the terminations were tied to shifting away attention from certain programs that were community, nonprofit driven, and equity focused, and into preserving law enforcement led approaches and really more conservative and quote traditional ways of addressing crime, right? So CVLN and many other organizations are fighting against these cuts legally, and as of now, CVI orgs largely did not get funding reinstated, although there's 1 to 2 examples of CVIPI awardees getting some funding back. The second funding issue I want to flag, we saw a big funding shift in the FY25 CVIPI solicitation. So that's basically the funding opportunity notice for the grant program. Because the fiscal year 2025 bill, I won't try not to get too technical and politically nerdy here, but because the FY25 bill was funded through a year-long continuing resolution, which means that the funding levels would replicate the previous year. We would have expected to see up to 50 million invested in CVIPI through appropriations and another 50 million through the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. So potentially reaching up to 100 million. In reality, this past fall, DOJ only planned to award about $34 million for this grant program. So that's a major cut. So I think what that really shows is Congress, even when Congress supports these programs, and this administration specifically, there's no guarantee that the full funding actually gets out the door. And that creates real instability for the CVI field that's really trying to plan and operate long term. So next, I'll get into the political aspect and landscape of this. So this is the president's second time around in office. So his team came very prepared with radical political agenda that quickly shifted funding levels, priorities, and program structures. And because a lot of the Republican members of Congress, their constituents are specifically Trump supporters, they're more hesitant to really call out obviously wrong actions and policies. So one thing I do want to flag about the CVI PI solicitation, we didn't only see a funding shift, but we also saw the intent of the program was moved away from Congress's original vision for it as a community-centered public health approach program serving communities, right? So in this latest solicitation, community-based organizations are no longer eligible to apply for the funding. They have to go through law enforcement or a government agency, mostly city, county, state governments. And the language throughout the solicitation also leans more heavily on supporting law enforcement rather than recognizing the independent role that community-based organizations play in reducing gun violence. And then we also saw new requirements tied to coordination with ICE. While those requirements do technically apply to the primary awardee, the city, county, state government, CBOs may often have to just comply and meet the project expectations because they're a subcontractor. So that's still something that has to be navigated and something, we're trying to figure out right now and making sure advocacies to go against that is in the middle of it, which I'll talk about later. So just on that, when you take a step back, it's not just technical changes in these solicitations, it's really a broader shift in how the Trump administration is thinking about who should be leading in the public safety ecosystem. Lastly, on the political front, I do want to take just a brief time to address DHS and the gun violence that's happened there. As you all know, within the last couple of months, we've seen how ICE enforcement has directly impacted communities. So there were ICE officers obviously involved in shootings, and that later raised a lot of concerns and questions. So once Kristi Noem was booted, basically Secretary Mark McMillan came in, and I just wanted to flag he's looking to take a different approach from the previous secretary and have ICE work more through local law enforcement rather than them being on the front line. So I know we have a few couple minutes left. Lastly, I just wanted to move to what's sustainable versus what's not, and just really the advocacy part of it. So I know I've talked about not a lot of great things or good news federally, but there is a silver lining. So in the last fiscal appropriations funding bill for FY26, it did include $50 million to fund community violence intervention. This is a huge win, regardless of what's in the solicitation, because we have full Republican control and the program is continued to be funded. It's important to keep a budget item line for CVIPI while we work to change the harmful details and requirements in the solicitation. So I wanted to acknowledge that. And then the second part is what's needed, what we need to do. Obviously, the solicitation, DHS remains an issue, but the groundwork is needed now to really see changes before the political dynamic shifts, right? We don't want to wait until Democrats are in power to really put a lot of effort into getting what we think is best for the community. So at the core of that is messaging. We need messaging that is strong and also is tailored to the folks that we are trying to educate and convince to support this funding, which obviously is a no-brainer to us. This CVI makes a great impact on communities, but a lot of these members just do not understand or are not as putting as much effort to really understand the concept. So we have to make sure they do. So that includes moderate Democrats. There's obviously we have support from Democrats, but there are more moderate Democrats who may not understand CVI as much or support it the way some others do. And then Senate Republicans who are conservative, but they obviously represent an entire state. So they're a bit more open to understanding, the value and working with us. So that means having data, case studies. How have CVI organizations helped specific individuals? How often was person A involved in gun violence? When did they stop? How long were they stopped? And then what positive aspects happened in their life? How did their life change? Also, proof of partnerships with other entities. CBOs, as you all know, work with different groups. So I think it's good to highlight the other community stakeholders that either support CVI organizations or work with them. And then it's just really important, just want to emphasize again, curating a story that's digestible to moderate and conservatives at this time, while also obviously maintaining program integrity and what we believe in. So just an example, as you all know, a couple years ago when Republicans were in power in the House and we had Democrats in the Senate, we engaged the National Sheriff's Association, most conservative law enforcement group in the country, and got them to write a letter of support for CVI, asking for $200 million. Part of that success was the messaging that we used in explaining the value of this, right? So that messaging is really what got the CEO to say, you know what, we can stand behind this. And that really was the reason we got a part of a big reason we got funding continued for this program. Then lastly, just want to flag in terms of the Invest in Us coalition that's led by Community Justice. We are working on the appropriations committee, including report language that would ensure funding that is put out under CVIPI moving forward is prioritizing communities that have the highest rates of homicides and shootings, and then making sure that at least 50 or more percent of the awards go to community-based organizations. Yes, we would love to say 100, but we have to work with the type of political environment that we have right now. So I will pause there and pass it to Jose to talk about the state part and then also continue from there. So.
Thank you, Pam. So we are getting ready to get into our insights, but just before we get into some insights that we want to gather, I just want to name that over the last few years, especially with funding from the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, you all have really been building power both on the ground and in your states, being able to get some wins in whether it's CVI funding or working to ensure that we had offices of gun violence prevention or community violence intervention program expansions, right? We see all of the work that you all have been doing, and this is why our policy advocacy has to continue, and it has to continue with strength and consistency. Building that local and state power right now is going to help us to continue to build up our national power and leverage as we continue to see political winds shifting and changing. And in order for us to be able to do that, we also want to make sure that we are meeting the mark with what you all need on the ground right now. And so I wanted to make sure that we had some insights that we gathered from everybody so that we could get a pulse on what is happening, and it could also fuel our next steps and our next strategies in order for us to look at a solid policy agenda for years to come. And so our first question, and please feel free to use the chat to respond. Which priority feels most urgent to you in today's federal and state landscape? And so what policy priorities or what priorities are your organizations or your communities facing that feel most urgent that need to be addressed by policy advocacy in this current landscape? And you all can hit the chat. And as folks are talking in the chat or putting insights into the chat, we'll read a few out loud. So which policy priorities or what priorities feel most urgent to your organization, to your community, to the things that you're seeing and facing in today's federal and state landscape? And just want to emergency housing, victims of violence, okay. Appropriations, both on the state and federal side, increasing funding. Receiving additional funding for workforce and employment and reentry. Permanently funding CVI. Addressing violent hate crimes. Falling VOCA distributions. Youth justice. Personal safety for families and children when families are kidnapped. Loss of resources. Dedicating permanent funding at a jurisdiction level. Committed CVI funding. Gun violence resolutions, especially suicide prevention. multi-year strategic planning to support communities, and to fully support communities, funding non-CVI work with CVI dollars, mental health supports. Okay. And y'all can keep going, and we'll keep answering questions, or we'll keep asking questions. So just as some more context, right? The CVI Action Plan Advocacy pillar led by Community Justice is really focusing on ensuring that we are thinking about what's next, what our strategies are going to be, and how your insights continue to inform our strategies. So all of your insights are really going to be used to both support the ongoing work, but then to also structure or restructure how we think about our advocacy strategy at every level of government. Next slide. So based on what you're seeing today, in 2026, what would you like to add, or what do you think needs to be added to the CVI Action Plan to strengthen it? Based on today, the advocacy plan brought out in 2024, I believe. Based on today's political climate, what do you think needs to be added to strengthen the CVI Action Plan? And again, the chat box is your homie, so please, 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 we'd love to hear your insights. We also see some of the questions in the Q&A box, and we are getting ready to, we're going to go into a Q&A session as well, and so we'll make sure to answer some of these. So if you haven't gotten an answer, or if you have questions, please make sure to put them in your in the Q&A box so that we can queue them up for the Q&A session. And I believe we have a link to the CVI Action Plan as well to ensure that, you know, if you need to skim through it one more time or just kind of get some brain juices going, we'll be able to share that with you. And we can come back to this question as well. So let's go to the next slide while we have folks just reviewing the action plan once again. So in this next phase of our advocacy, as we look at the current political climate, and then as we look at hope for the future, right? Whether you are looking at local fights for CVI funding and building out an ecosystem, or state level fights and actions, and thinking about our federal landscape, what are some of the things that should not be lost in this next iteration of our advocacy agenda? What do we want to ensure that we are keeping and that we are in the spirit of, that we are stewards of in this next iteration? We got tested and shared messaging that we can all use. Really vet programs that state that they're actually doing CVI. Wellness for frontline staff. All really great ideas, y'all. What must not be lost as we think about the future of our policy agenda? As you're talking to advocacy organizations, national organizations, organizations that are supporting your organizing and your power building, organizing advocacy and your legislative agenda, what do you want to say to them? You want to keep the heart. That's real. What can't be lost in this next iteration of the work? Maybe another way to frame that question is like, what do you want to see out of a policy agenda? What would be a policy agenda that feels like represents the needs, the realities, the lived experience of those in your community, frontline workers, CVI organizations, and leaders, people most at risk? And here I am not scrolling, which is why I didn't see anything. See, look at me, Jose. All right, encouraging voting and voter registration, particularly this November. Be together and collaborate. Black leadership, fidelity to the work. The heart of our why. Checking in with folks on the ground to see what they need. We can't lose our focus on the people at highest risk. Making sure that it doesn't get diluted. We must continue to center boots on the ground. Okay. Can't lose our awareness of the system and using the tools to cause infighting. So I hear wanting to make sure that we're together and collaborating. Ghost guns are a big issue. Y'all, all of these are amazing and great, and we're really excited about, how we can take all of these insights and continue to frame our policy agenda. At this point, we're going to start our Q&A portion, and I'm going to pass it back over to Brother Eddie.
Thanks, Jose. In the spirit of the questions you're asking here, right?
You're on mute, Eddie.
Am I on mute?
Oh, I can hear. I can hear you.
Okay, sorry. So, Jose, in the spirit that you are sharing these questions, I I want to ask the audience a question here too, right? As we think about, I mean, like we're seeing some really incredible comments and questions being asked here. And I think that the question before we jump in, I want to ask the audience a specific question. What what is that one thing, right, that really is preventing you, whether you're a direct service provider, you're a researcher, you're in the policy space, like what's that one thing that's really that you see either preventing you or you see as a common issue for us to continuing to like really in sync our voice in this? Like, so for example, is it the lack of understanding how policies work? Is there a lack of maybe research, or is there a lack of evidence, or is it maybe that we're just not coordinated, right? Like, I just like I want to take less than a minute, see what kind of response we get here. I'm seeing funding already. Manuela's telling me she can't hear me. Can you guys hear me though? All right. So just very curious, and some of you already kind of alluded to that already, that question or some responses. And I think before I jump into the question with both Pam and Jose here, here's was prompting that for me. So for a decade and a half, I really have been just focusing on direct service. And at the time there was a big there was not necessarily the best relationships when it came to research. And a lot of when I look back, I think about just my level of ignorance of not understanding of how to apply research, how to apply data, right, in my day-to-day work. And sometimes that became very frustrating for me. That made me feel a certain way about just the relevance of data and research. And I would always say to people like, who cares about that? We're on the ground, we're doing the work, we got to do the right thing for the people. And then I started realizing more and more that there's just not enough people on the ground doing this work. We just didn't have enough people. And there were so many people that were not in support of serving those that were at a higher risk of needs, whether it's young, adolescents or even emerging adults. And as I look back and I reflect, I think a lot of it had to do with just not having a strong narrative, not being, as Stevenson points out, this idea of building proximity. We just weren't doing that. And Pam said something very, very important earlier about the importance of working across the aisle, right? Meeting with Republicans and Democrats. You don't have to see eye to eye with everything, but when it comes to public health and public safety, which predominantly have been the two biggest frameworks that we've used to like really legitimize our work, there's probably others. There's still a need, right, for us to think about what are successful ways of engaging not just political leaders, but sometimes our own family members, our own congregations, our own neighbors, our neighboring cities or towns or suburbs. And I think that when I say all the trips that I did within DOJ, and even now all the listenings that we've been doing with the CVI Action Plan Committee, that still remains to be very evident to me is the the need to coordinate more of our voices, the need to train more of the staff from the ground, people who are doing the direct service, to those that are, in doing the work that, Pam and Jose are doing. And so I think about what does community organizing training really look like for many of our communities? How do we really draw where our mutual interests are at, and where do we see the value, right, with others as well? So I'm stating that because that is what I'm hoping this next portion of this conversation really takes us. I'm hoping that we could have a little bit more of that open dialogue about what we see working, what's shifting, where do we see some promise, what are those best practices, what are your recommendations, Jose and Pam, as we look ahead with this current administration, but also as we think about the following administration. Lastly, through the Bipartisan Community Safety Act, lots of advocacy went behind that. And we had a very short runway to make that happen. And at the end, we were included for $250 million, and DOJ put some additional resources there. But what is $250 million compared to when I see all the other investments that we have around early childhood development, other public safety, strategies? Um, it's a drop in the bucket. What would it look like if we had $5 billion dedicated to CVI and its ecosystem, right? The people who are doing the direct service, with engaging those high-risk individuals, but also all the agencies that are providing the wraparound services for those individuals. And so with that, I want to open it up with Jose and Pam as I read through some of these questions. But as we face a shifting political landscape, and the potential of disinvestments or ongoing disinvestments, how should the CVI field adapt its advocacy and approach to both defend existing wins and continue advancing policy, both locally and nationally?
Yeah, sure. You put that so well. I mean it's a loaded question for sure, but I can start. I think there's so much evidence of the work you all have done on the field, street violence intervention, hospital-based cognitive behavioral therapy, all of that. And I think it's really important to, and I know in this political dynamic, it's hard because those Republicans, we do have to work across the aisle, and I acknowledge that some of the Republicans that are out there are really pushing policies and ideas that don't resonate or with our beliefs, our morals. So it's really challenging. But I think if we're thinking about CVI in the long run and getting, like Eddie said, $5 billion, we do have to sacrifice in a way and make sure we're really talking to people across the aisle and really explaining the value of it. So I think part of that's working together. A lot of local, or I think somebody in the chat box said like we need people that do the work on the ground be in those policy conversations. And I think that's really important, right? I think part of like community justice congressional meetings day next week is that to have people on the ground that do the work really meet with these members of Congress and staff and explain like this is what we're doing, this is who supports it, and this is the actual impact we've seen in the reduction of homicides and shootings. I also think I understand with the current CVIPI solicitation, it's completely, essentially the opposite of what the original intent was. And I know the opportunities seem limited, but we do have to keep advocating for the funding bucket, and not necessarily wait till there's a change in the political dynamic. Because if we don't do that now, that may not be in the priority list of either Democrats or Republicans. So just for example, like Break the Cycle of Violence Act passed towards the end of 2022 in the House, but the Senate Democrats weren't able to sign it into law, right? And they were in power. So all that to say, and I'll stop soon. I think we need more cohesiveness in the data, the people that are at the table, and just our messaging to the members of Congress. And part of that is, let's say, Tennessee Senator Haggerty, and it may be collaborating with him on a site visit. I saw there was a group that works on the field that has done collaborated with different senators and members, and that really helps the movement. So I think things of that nature are really important. So I can stop there and pass it to Jose, and we can go back and forth. So
Yeah, thank you. I think very similarly to the way that we think about professional development for the field, part of that is also professional development around some of the advocacy components, right? Building out local infrastructures for rapid response, for policy advocacy, for lobbying and community organizing to help build a power system that'll allow us to create networks like the network that we created during Protect CVI, right? We were all in unison. We were all singing the same song. We were all in the same messaging, same branding, and we were all brought together under one cause. Similarly, I think the field is going to figure out how they're defining CVI through this process, right? And I think that in that definition, we're able to have more targeted advocacy and create the stories and narratives that may be even more helpful to our overall advocacy. And then finally, I think at the federal level, it is bringing folks together from all parts of the country to be able to continue to do that advocacy work and continue to all speak in unison, to have those message strategies, to have those organizing tactics, to have the trainings to build people up. And we're really excited to be able to do that.
All right, well, thank you both for that. So I'm going to read a comment, but also kind of frame it in a question. There was one of the comments that said, it's cool that the national orgs want to push for CVI, PI, but local orgs have such limited capacity. I'm not sure it's worth their energy to support a program that they can't use until we change administrations. And there's a lot of people, Jose, Pam, that feel that way right now. It's like, hey, we don't have enough manpower, we don't have enough hours, right, to really devote to changing at the local or at that even at the federal level, right? Like pushing for federal policy changes because funding is being cut nationally and locally. They're trying to figure out how to keep their lights, on and how to provide minimum services at times. And as someone who's done social services, right, I could really relate to that. That you're at the whims a lot of times at the government grants you have. Not everybody has the luxury of having philanthropic, dollars to support their work, or sometimes you have to weave some of that. But nevertheless, like, what would you say, right, to those who are on a call and others who might listen to this recording down the line? Like, how would you empower them, and what would you say to encourage them to strike that balance, right? To invest um, on what we might think about as a long-term investment for this work, in which, by the way, they might benefit directly or they might not. That's also another big challenge when it comes with this kind of work. And sometimes when I hear that, I also think about people's egos, right? And I'm not saying the person who wrote this comment. I'm just saying overall, and I would include myself in that as well, right? Like, why am I going to do this if I'm not going to benefit? I'm putting all this skin in the game. So, any thoughts that any of you could share around that?
Yeah, for sure. I'll start. I think there's a great benefit, and even if, let's say, one org isn't directly getting that funding opportunity in that moment, I think getting federal and state traction for CVI will allow more philanthropic funding or just more funding at the local and state level instead of, let's say, 10 million, it'll go up to 15 and 20. I think in turn it really helps the movement largely. And like, yes, we've seen federal funding cut when Trump re-entered office, but we also saw in a Republican sweep that we have now in the House and Senate, CVI funding was funded at $50 million. They could have zeroed it out. And we could say they could have done something to really a lot of things, but that money was maintained. Yes, it's 50 million compared to 100, 200 million, but I think consistency will really show long-term progress and success. And I think those small bits, especially in the federal space, because things aren't instantaneous. I think those small bits of effort and movement are really worthwhile. And advocacy groups like CJ and others, that's what we're here for, to really help you prepare to engage members of Congress. We understand you all have a lot of work that you all do on the ground and are very busy, and it takes a huge mental toll, the work that you all do. So that's what we're here for, to really prepare you all for that. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I have two answers for this. I think one is a little more like ethereal, if you will. We're all accountable to each other. This is a ecosystem, and the way that I think about ecosystems is that if something happens in one place, it impacts something in another place, right? And I think that, for a while, especially because there are a lot of folks who, have had to survive and who have had to, really try to fight for funding and keep their funding. There's this like I got to keep mine. I got to make sure that I have what I need to be able to serve my community. And I think that is true. The other thing that is true is that we are all facing the same system. We have all seen divestment. We have all seen the ways in which our communities are in need of people who are saving lives, right? And so I think from a communal perspective, right, it is a benefit to all of us that we stay involved in this fight at the national level. From an organizing perspective, it builds power. From an organizing perspective, from the perspective of movement building, if you are consistent, if you are building with others, then you can have bigger fights. You have more power to be able to have bigger fights, right? I think somebody told me something about CVI funding that was cut at a municipal level, and she was like, "Yo, the reason why we didn't get this funding was because we didn't have enough power to sway the city council. And we didn't have enough power to sway city council because we were too busy trying to figure out our own bag, right?" And so when we think about the collective good, that isn't just an ethereal conversation. It's a strategy to build power.
Yeah. Yeah. Jose, you both of you has like tremendous comments there that I wish we had more time to really kind of just go deeper in those comments. And again I want to reflect, and I mentioned earlier in my earlier career just the kind of the frustration, right? The lack of like really embracing data and research. But let me tell you, like I also had the same issue with policy, uh, particularly when I was organizing people who've been formerly, just as impacted, who had minor offenses, and trying to convince the state of Illinois to change some of their current policies so that they could benefit. While someone like myself who had a violent offense, and most of my friends had violent offenses, we didn't benefit from all the trips that we would take to our state capital, and a lot of times it was just like coming out of your own pocket, right? But for me at the time, it was I found it energetic, right, to be in rooms with people that were making decisions uh, about about my life, about my future, about where I could buy property or can't, or those kind of things. Where could I be employed? What kind of license I could have or not. And yet, the last 10, 15 years, there's been so much success when it has come to like the criminal justice reform. Like people are now reinstating their voting rights in some states. We're seeing some great work happening nationally around young people who've been sentenced to life without parole, getting those cases overturned. Many of them actually are working in the CVI field as well, both in DC and in other cities that I'm aware of. And there's a lot that we could learn from those kind of advocacy initiatives, right? They're like, what worked for them that now we're seeing all these kind of changes locally and nationally. And despite of people's comments around, what's the criminal justice political fatigue, right? I think it's just a bunch of BS, right? I think you mentioned accountability, Jose, a second ago. It's like this is where politicians don't want to be held accountable anymore. So they'll say something like that. Well, my colleagues, they're tired of talking about this issue. They're tired of talking about CVI, right? But I want to encourage us, and this is going to lead to another question I have here, and perhaps maybe our final question, which is where and how and who would you recommend are some unusual allies of ours that if we could be more intentional of building bridges with them, it would help us galvanize a stronger coordinated field out there? Like, are there any agencies, any partners that come to mind for you guys?
Yeah,
Yeah,
well,
go please.
I'll just briefly, I thought of a Democratic senator, Senator Chris Van Hollen. He is now the ranking member on the Senate committee that has jurisdiction over DOJ funding. And if the Senate does flip, he will essentially be the number one person in charge. So he is the person to really influence and talk to about the CBI community. And I know there's a lot of folks in Maryland that do this work and probably already have relationships with the senator. But I think looking at members on the Appropriations Committee, and both Republicans and Democrats, those are really the heavy hitter power players that can really change the funding dollars for a specific program, including CVIPI. So I really encourage people to talk with those folks, and that's someone. If you guys have any questions directly for me after this, happy to talk about that in the appropriations funding process at that level.
Yeah, I think on the organizing side, there are a few folks, right? I think Pam had mentioned the Sheriff's Association and the like. But I think about when we think about root cause issues, right? Quality education, healthcare, access to housing, food, right? Food justice, housing is an issue in and of itself, right? That has a movement of people. The ways in which we want to galvanize, and some of these other movements have had a little bit more time and a little bit more mature or older in their movement space. Another unlikely ally are veterans. I can't tell you enough how many people from my community, right, where I grew up in South Jamaica, Queens, New York, went off to the military, and they used to gangbang, right? And so these are members of our community who may have lived experience, but were able to, see a path who could also be good allies in the work and in the movement. But as we think about, our friends at the Hobby and HVIPs, medical practitioners, healthcare providers, those are also all really great folks to think about. So thinking outside the box and thinking about like what are the intersections and in the things that our communities are suffering from, and where are those movements living, and what are they talking about? And the last thing I'll say is, we were doing rapid response and supporting our brothers and sisters across the country when the ICE raids were happening, right? And one clear intersection that we saw was immigration justice and immigration rights work, and this work again, right? Like in places like Little Village in Chicago, and in places like Memphis, Tennessee, where they were also picking up folks as well. And so there are a number of unlikely allies there.
Yeah, this is great. Well, listen, Pam, Jose, thank you so much for the time you've given us here. We're coming close to the end here. I also just want to highlight that religious institutions, right, the faith-based community could play an instrumental role in this work as well. Jose, you got 1 minute to kind of share what we got coming up, and then I'll wrap us up with some last final reflections.
All right, good people. So we have tons happening and tons going on throughout the year. But right now, we are really excited to continue to work with Eddie and the rest of the committee on the CVI Action Plan Policy Advocacy Convening. If you want to learn more about the Policy Advocacy Convening, where it's at, how to get engaged, we have a very limited amount of seats available. Please hit us up at the cviconvening@gmail.com. And then also our registration is closed for the Advocacy Summit and our gala, as well as our congressional meeting day. But for those of y'all that are on who have not paid for registration yet and are coming, just want to make sure that we remind y'all, pay for your registration, please. It'll get you into the gala, it'll get you into the summit, and it'll also get you on the Hill talking to your member of Congress so that you can also talk about your needs and take them out of the chat box and into the halls of Congress.
Great. Thank you, Jose. Thank you so much, Pam. So, as we close out this final session on the CVI Action Plan webinar series, I want to leave us with a simple truth. Policy and advocacy are not, it's not just side work. They are the work. Everything that we're discussed, have been discussing across these 6 sessions becomes stronger, more sustainable, and more deeply rooted when it is backed by policy and protected in this advocacy, and it continues to be lifted up in the way that we have been successful in the past, in the last administration, and hopefully with this administration, or even as we think about forward. For years, CVI has been carried by people and organizations who stepped up long before there were funding streams, job descriptions, or national conversations. But we want this work to last. We want it to be recognized as an essential to public safety and to public health. Then, if that's the case, then we have to make sure that it is written into the systems that shape our communities. That's where each one of us come in. Everyone on this call, and your colleagues has an important role to play with this. You are the bridge, a bridge between the evidence we build and the policymakers who haven't yet been introduced to this field, a bridge between the urgency of today's violence and the long-term solutions for our communities, that what they deserve. Advocacy is not just speaking up, it's really bringing others with us. Policy is not just legislation, it's the commitment to make this work durable, reassured, and respected. So as we wrap up this series, it's been a great pleasure to be able to serve as your MC, to serve in organizing, coordinating this committee. There is a report that will be coming out shortly by the end of May, so we will get that to you. Given that we have your emails, we'll be sending this to you sometime the end of May, early June at the latest. And so I look forward to continue working with you. And if you have any questions, any thoughts, please reach out to the contact that you see below on the screen. With that, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy the rest of the spring. Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you.